welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Christy Keating. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone. Welcome back, podcast listeners. I am so happy to be sharing another episode of the Heartful Parent Podcast with you this week. This week, I am thrilled to introduce you to Dr. Joanne Light. Joanne is a parent empowerment coach, a mother, and a grandmother, and is also a retired college administrator and counselor. She earned her doctorate in education and counseling from Boston University and chose to further her expertise through a life coaching certification and a certification in training emotional intelligence. And that's what we're going to be digging into today. Joanne's coaching practice currently focuses on the challenges and strategies parents need to navigate their parenting journey. Through research and personal experience, Joanne continues to pursue her passion for heart-centered coaching and for contributing to raising the next generation. Her appearances on radio shows, podcasts, and summits have enabled her to share her expertise with a diverse audience. And her contribution to the compilation book, No Problem Parenting, Raising Your Kids with More Confidence and Less Fear, is now an Amazon bestseller. I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation because, as I mentioned, we're going to dig into emotional intelligence. And Joanne shares with us the 4 elements of emotional intelligence and really has some beautiful ways of reframing or rethinking some things that may be on your mind. Most powerfully, I will note that she talks about the difference between wanting to do something and being willing to do it. The way she talks about that is really quite simple and brilliant in its simplicity. So I hope you'll get a ton out of this conversation. I know I did. Without further ado, Dr. Joanne Light. Joanne, welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I am thrilled to have you here.
Thank you, Christy. It's great to be here.
I would like to jump in and just start with, you're a retired college administrator and counselor. You now are a parent empowerment coach. Mm-hmm. Talk to me a little bit about that transition and what led you into the field that you are now in, that we share.
We do share. I actually have always been in human services. I started out teaching Latin and Greek in my career when I was quite a bit younger. And I moved from teaching high school kids, and I love teens. So I love to work with parents who have teenagers and their complete plethora of issues and loveliness. And then I went back to school and got my doctorate. So I then joined the staff of a community college. And if anybody knows anything about community college, they're the most incredible places where things happen that nobody expects to happen. And students ages 18 to 90 are there. And I worked my way through the system and started simply as a counselor working with women at nights when my children were small. And then I moved into administration, and I enjoyed it because I felt like I was reaching lots of people. But there was a time where I just said, okay, managing people is messy. That's enough. And I retired from the state system and went forward thinking I was just going to freewheel my time, but decided I still had stuff to offer and I wanted to continue to give back. So I started a coaching practice, and I do love it. It's wonderful when you're working with a parent, as you well know, and all of a sudden they have this aha moment. Yeah. They were all set to tell you something, how they were right and this was wrong. And it just suddenly they get something, even a little something, a little, pebble, stone, whatever, a teardrop of something that makes a difference. And the transition, I think there was some fear involved. I think we all, when we start to do something different, experience some concern. Is this going to work? How will I do? What am I feeling right now? And then I got very excited about emotional intelligence, which, as you know, has been around since the 90s, but it has become the big buzzword.
Yes.
Everyone is talking about it. It's showing up in schools, which is really important. It's showing up in corporations, which is more unbelievable, because corporate culture, as many of us know, it can be very difficult. So it's something that can really strengthen parent-kid relationships. And I got a certificate in training people in emotional intelligence, and I try to use it whenever I can, because it's a skill that involves lifelong learning. And as a parent, if you make a commitment, knowing something about it and growing with your kids as you explore it, I think it's a great thing. So I don't know. That was a pretty long answer to a simple question.
No,
Transition
it was great.
is always hard.
It was great because I think there are many people listening that can probably relate to the idea that, myself included, we have different phases in our professional careers, and sort of it can be really interesting the way one thing kind of leads into the next. And we have unexpected things, just as, you mentioned that our clients sometimes have those unexpected ahas.
Yeah.
We all have those moments. But I love that you focus on emotional intelligence, because what we know, and we're going to dig into this with you, of course, is my understanding of the research is that emotional intelligence is more predictive of success in relationships, in careers, in parenting than what we typically think of as intelligence, right? The IQ.
That's right.
Is less important than the EQ. So let's dig in there and talk a little bit about, what do we mean when we say emotional intelligence? And then one step beyond that, I know you talk about that there are some basic elements of it. Let's talk about that.
Sure. Well, emotional intelligence is a skill set that you can't acquire in a 30-minute podcast, it's a lifelong kind of skill, but it's a question of making a commitment to it. These are skills, the 4 areas we can talk about are skills that help you manage your own emotions and those of the people around you, especially in the moment. I think we all think, okay, I'm emotionally intelligent. I know how to answer and I know what I'm feeling, but it's so important to recognize and not react, but respond. And that in the moment, your kid is making you nuts or having a tantrum in public, whatever it is, what you do in that moment is very important and takes lots of skill to do, quote unquote, what is acceptable. And it's important not to worry so much about what people are thinking, but how you respond develops sort of a routine and a continuum for your children.
I just have to share that, like, my personal mantra, because I can be sort of naturally reactive. And so I will, and my husband giggles at me because I will actually get in the midst of something and I'll say, I am responding, not reacting. I'm responding, not, and I have to remind myself of that. It's hard sometimes.
It's very hard. And the fact that you do that, Christy, that you have developed at least the beginnings of real self-awareness, because when you can stop yourself in your tracks, pause and let something go and say, what am I feeling right now? And why am I doing this? And what happened in the past that is making me do this now? It's a process, and it's not really easy. Sometimes I talk, and my youngest child is a young adult, 35 years old, male. He was the prince because he has 2 older sisters. And he's taught me something recently in our interactions, because he's going through this career thinking, changing, planning, relationship development. And it's different to be willing to do something and wanting to do it. And every parent wants to do the best holistic sort of job of parenting and bring everything together and raise a competent, contributing, compassionate child into adulthood who will be successful. But wanting that and being willing to do the hard work that is involved in getting to your goal, those are 2 different things. I think we use want and will a little interchangeably. And he has been teaching me that in how I react to him and respond to him and vice versa. Just a little side story, because I think people can relate when you tell your story a little bit. His older sisters are terrific, wonderful people, but they each have their issues. My oldest daughter had some definite mental health issues that are still present, but she's adjusted and adapting. My second oldest daughter had a serious eating disorder when she was in high school and the beginning of college, and she chose to change it and to address it. But Sam, who was the baby at the time, I think watched what was going on around him in the family. And I think anytime there's issues in a family, it affects all the siblings in different ways. He just decided he wasn't going to cause any trouble. And so he pushed down and was golden boy as often as he could and didn't really let the emotions that were building out. And when he turned 30, for some reason, he finally he exploded with all these emotions. So we've been talking lately about, I want to look at myself, but am I willing to do the work? And I think when I start with parents, I don't know about you, as early on as I can, I try to remind them it starts with them and that we have to listen, we have to respect our children and build trust. And it doesn't work when you're a controlling, sort of punitive parent. We have to learn how to develop that intrinsic motivation in our kids. And I think all too often in our culture now, we worry about the outcome as opposed to the process.
Yes.
But we all have to, I'm sure, your generational bias, you grew up and your parents did A, B, C, D. So maybe that's how you respond or you react so definitely that you go way the other way. So there's a lot of balance and growth involved.
There is. And you're right. Like you, I do remind parents both on this podcast and in my individual work with them that it starts with us. I often have clients who say, my kid won't listen. I need you to fix them kind of thing. Right.
Exactly.
And we have to start with our own reactivity and,
and your mantra
skills and all of my mantra, all of those things. But this framing of the difference between wanting something and willing to do it. I think that applies to so many parts of our life. Like, I want to be healthy. Am I willing to do the work to be healthy? And that applies emotionally, mentally, physically, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely.
And the willingness is really where the work is.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally agree.
And where the hard work is.
And it is hard work.
Yeah.
We give birth and have children because that's what we do. But no one said it was going to be as hard as it is. No,
isn't that the truth?
That. No matter how many things you read or neighbors talk to you or friends, it's way harder than you thought it might be. Oh, I can do that. It's tough.
It is so tough. I know I was caught unaware by that, right? By how difficult it was, which is, like many of us, led me into the work that I do now.
I'm sure.
Because it is so much tougher. And I often say we were never meant to parent alone. And yet so many of us are trying to do that.
Yeah, that's very, very difficult.
So going back to this emotional intelligence piece, I think your framing of this is so brilliant with the difference between being, wanting something and being willing to do it. Somebody wants to be emotionally intelligent and they say they're willing to do the work. What are the primary skills or the primary elements of emotional intelligence that they can kind of hone in on?
One, and I think one of the most important pieces is self-awareness. If you ask the general population, you get 10 people in a room and said, are you self-aware? Most of them are going to say, oh, absolutely. But I don't know if that's really true. To really, truly be self-aware, that you understand, you recognize emotions, you understand where they're coming from, you've thought about it, you're willing to express them, and you have a language of emotions. We live in a culture where I think people, when they think of emotions, they think mad, sad, or happy. Well, there's a huge vocabulary of emotions. And if you can develop that vocabulary so you can talk about not just frustration, but exasperation or there's just a million words, they don't all come to mind. Overwhelmed, aggravated. If you're self-aware, you examine your own emotions and you think about them, you process them, and you try to understand how you react, how you behave, what your attitudes are, what your values are, and then point that compass toward becoming self-aware. And it's hard. And parents who are self-aware show up for their kids. And when we think about showing up, the first thing lots of people will do, is I go to their plays, I go to their sporting events, I take them to the doctor. Yes, I agree, Christy, that's a piece of showing up. But there's a more important piece of showing up that I think your self-awareness and emotional intelligence relates to. It's your kid feels seen and heard. You validate their emotions. So you can, and empathy, of course, is one of the 4 areas of emotional intelligence. Developing empathy, understanding what empathy truly is, and showing it to your kids, which involves listening and participating in their lives in a way they understand. So if they feel seen, if they feel soothed, that you're going to be there, you might not like what they did, but you love them nonetheless, and they know that, they really trust that. That's hard to do. It's so easy to say, what the heck were you thinking? You're so ridiculous. You're so stupid, but, if you can get beyond that with your children and build trust. So if they feel seen and they feel soothed, I think these S's were Dan Siegel who came up with the four S's of showing up.
Safe, seen, soothed, and secure.
That's right.
Yep.
And then if you can do all those, they feel safe, which is how you should show up for your kids. And again, we all want that, but it takes some work to actually do it.
Yeah.
And becoming self-aware and honest with yourself allows you to be, I think, honest, Christy, with the whole process of parenting. So self-awareness is one.
I want to comment on that
just
for a moment, because I think you're absolutely right that we all think we're self-aware, but actually being that self-aware, going back to that, difference between wanting and willing. I want to be self-aware, but am I really willing to look internally? And I think that's the single hardest piece of parenting is being aware of how we are contributing to whatever challenges are developing.
And how you do it, you're absolutely correct, I think, is modeling for your children. So they're going to adapt similar methodology to what they see you doing. So if you say one thing and then they see you doing another, like gossiping, if you tell them don't gossip and don't tattletale, and then they hear you on the phone or in text or in a conversation, not being totally honest and authentic, that's a conflict for them. So you really need to model with your values and make it clear to them what's important to you. So self-awareness, that's a biggie.
Love it. Okay. You also mentioned empathy as one of the key pieces of emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is one of those things where I think if you ask somebody, are you empathetic? They'll say, well, yeah, of course. But we all know people who are not very empathetic. Maybe sometimes we even struggle with our own empathy, especially when it comes to our children who we're like, why are they doing that thing, right? Or why are they having that feeling? And the empathy can be a little bit difficult. So how do we get more in touch or in tune with our own empathy?
Good question again. I think it's practice that you try to be kind of a detective, and whatever is going on and what behavior you're seeing, don't assume you understand where it's coming from. And when they're too little, of course, it's harder. They can't really express to you. But as time goes on, you have to sort of try to understand, where is this emotional reaction, or what happened with a friend, or why, how they feel about school. And you truly listen, especially with your adolescents. You listen, meaning you don't interrupt. You try to be non-judgmental, which is very difficult because you automatically have an opinion of what they're wearing to school or how they talk to the teacher or whatever.
Yes.
And you try to think about their perspective. And that's really hard. Teens are going through a lot of changes in their brains. So their impulsivity is not just to make you mad. It's just their brains are making them be impulsive. And it's only, as you know, the last 10, 15 years that we really even know this. So when I was a teenager, people were clueless why we were hopping off and doing what we were doing. But if you can develop true empathy, then you're trying to understand where they're coming from. And you try to talk about their actions and their attitudes based on your own. And they feel that you understand. You understand, and then they can make better choices. So when they make bad choices, which is fine. I mean, making mistakes is great when they're still under your roof. And you can talk about consequences and behavior, and they'll know whether you know with your friends or the community. Genuine empathy is a little different than a more disingenuous kind of empathy. Oh yeah, I know what you're feeling. I've been there. I get it. Yeah. Maybe not. And it's hard to know exactly how someone else is feeling, but true empathy means you can put yourself in someone else's shoes and try to understand, or just listen. I mean, listening is truly, because I think especially in relationships, which is something that emotional intelligence, I think, helps us with all of our social relationships. Sometimes people, they don't want you to fix it. Your kids don't need you to necessarily fix whatever it is that's going on, but they want you to listen. Somebody recently sent me a great little video. I can send it to you. Called The Nail in the Head. So this woman is talking to her partner.
Yes.
And there's a nail. Have you seen that?
Yes.
I mean, the point of it is that I don't want you to fix it. I just need to vent. You need to listen to me. And when you really listen carefully and watch body language, you can develop empathy. And it's a very important piece of emotional intelligence.
It really strikes me that the opposite of empathy, and maybe there's two opposites, are judgment and the need to fix, or the inclination to fix. Because when we're showing up in a place of judgment, or from I can fix this for you, or I know how you should fix this, then we're not sitting in that empathetic space. And, you mentioned like teenagers, and I have a teenager at home right now, and they do and say and think some crazy things sometimes, right? And I love my daughter dearly, and she's pretty awesome. But there are times when I think, what in the world? And it's so easy to jump to that place of judgment. And then when when an issue arises, I mean, I've been around a lot longer than her, right? I have a good idea how you can fix this. But it takes me and all of us so quickly out of that empathetic space. Yes. And then it shuts them down.
Oh, yeah. 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 It's like when when you're talking about drugs and alcohol with your kids, all of a sudden you start this big lecture based on an experience they had. Well, they haven't listened past your first 10 words. I think that's not a good methodology. It's just, and it's so, honestly, I know I have 3 adult children. Listening is by far the most difficult thing you try to do with your kids sometimes.
Yes.
And if you can let them open up to you, you can build. I mean, emotional intelligence allows parents, once they understand, to build and nurture the relationship with their children, particularly with your teens and adolescents, who are difficult by virtue of being adolescents. So yeah, empathy is tough, and it's different than compassion, and it's different than sympathy. I think we get, those are not all the same things.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing to point out, just as you've, pointed out the difference between wanting and willing. Empathy, compassion, sympathy, those are all different, and there's important nuance there.
Right.
What are some of the other? You've mentioned obviously self-awareness, empathy. What are the other?
Self-regulation. That is a big one in emotional intelligence. You can't help your children learn to regulate their emotions if you don't manage your own. And that's, again, wanting and willing, that our same dichotomy. I mean, it is hard to regulate, but you need to practice. When your child or your colleague or your employee is upset and going on, you have to kind of step back, take a pause, and say, okay, what am I feeling right now? Is it fair what I'm feeling? A series of questions that your self-awareness allows you to think about what you're feeling. If you can't manage your own emotions and your child misbehaves and you think they're, it's not that they're trying to aggravate you, they're having a hard time. So if you can't take a step back before you scream, and I don't think there's a parent alive who hasn't reacted by screaming and yelling and going down the rabbit hole, which go to your room or whatever it is.
Yeah. Guilty as charged.
I mean, it just is natural human behavior, but when you practice enough and think about emotional intelligence and work on your own regulation and your own self-awareness, you model it for your kids. If they see that you don't get screaming and yelling, and you can have a conversation either then or later, but it's very important. If you don't regulate your own emotions, people around you don't really listen. They expect you to be dysregulated. And being dysregulated is a pretty normal human kind of place to be. And it's hard to get over that. It's very hard. And our kids, when they're little, are all dysregulated to a point.
Right. Well, and I think it's really hard. And you mentioned this a while ago. I think self-regulation is something that we learn. And if we didn't have a parent who was well self-regulated, self-aware, empathetic, it's that much harder,
right,
I think, to learn it ourselves. And, I love my dad dearly, but there are moments when I think, oh, this is my dad coming through, because he was not terribly self-regulated. And so when I find myself in those moments, I'm like, I know exactly where it's coming from. And then, but then there's the work of shifting it.
Right. I mean, understanding where someone's coming from is a part of being emotionally intelligent, but sometimes it doesn't matter where they're coming from. You want them to just stop right now and deal with in the moment. And, we all know two things can be true at the same time. Your child is disappointing you, but you love them unconditionally. And both are true. It's just what you do. Like I said in the beginning, I think being in the moment helps you be an emotionally intelligent person.
Yes. Yes. Showing up, being present.
Yes. Being present. Yeah.
Okay. So self-awareness, empathy, self-regulation.
Oh, I think the other part of it has all been kind of mentioned is social relationships. It's building relationships. I think when you're emotionally intelligent and you have certain skills, it's easier to show kindness and empathy and compassion and to understand people and to be resilient yourself. And when there's a difficult emotion that comes up in you, instead of ignoring or walking away or dismantling it, you try to work it through. And I think that leads to better trusting relationships with your kids. And when they trust you, people think, my kids don't trust me. How are they supposed to trust me? I think you will parent from a place of trust and not fear. I think it's the fear and the anxiety that creeps in and overwhelms us all the time.
Oh, yes. I mean, I think we all want so much for our children, right? We want so much for them. And I think you're absolutely right that many of us are parenting from a place of fear. And, one of the things I talk about as a child sexual abuse prevention expert, there's fears around those sorts of things, right?
Sure.
That are both legitimate and overblown in our culture. But then there's this fear, and I think we're all subject to this, of our children not achieving their potential, or our children, not going out into the world in the way that we want them, or them not having the outcome
that you imagine
that we are attached to. So maybe the next sort of logical question to go along with this is, how can we as parents work on reducing those fears, the outcome-based fears, not the boogeyman-based fears, but the outcome-based fears, and really increase our trust in our children and in our own parenting?
I think that is why you want to develop emotional intelligence, because if you know how to deal with emotions, both good and bad, because I don't really think there's so many good and bad. It's more just what is and how you respond to it. We're all fearful. I mean, there's so many things to be fearful of right now in our world, but you have to let your kids be who they are. If you have a projected outcome and our kids are motivated only by what they've achieved, their performance, as opposed to what is intrinsic, what is important to you, and you can communicate that to your children, and they feel that they have a certain amount of autonomy. I mean, yes, they need boundaries and rules. But if you can have them be part of that, Christy, I think it helps build trust. So it's like giving your teen a curfew. And if they adhere to it and they've responded, well, you expand the curfew and then they feel your trust. So
Yeah.
I think it's time consuming. It's hard, but those are part of just developing the relationship with your child, this holistic sort of, it sounds cheesy. And I think it sounds like, oh, that's impossible. But really, if you work at it and see little advances, I think you can learn to trust your kids and they know you trust them. That's that same thing of the 4 S's, that they feel safe and secure because they know you're going to be there no matter what.
Yeah.
So that with your teens, if they know they can always call you if they're in trouble.
Yes.
Those kinds of things lead to trust. But I think, how you grew up impacts how you do that. My parents had no idea where I was 98% of the time. I think, it was just a different, and my parents are a generation before your parents. So it just changes with each, millennial generation. So
it does.
But trust is a big part of social relationships. And that is something that can be an outcome of emotionally intelligent people. And that's why it's just as important as what academically your kids are achieving. We all want them to be successful academically, but we need to let them be who they are and who they're meant to be, not, making up for what you didn't do or for what you want them to become. I think that makes it very hard on a kid. You have to manage your expectations.
Yeah. Yeah. Our colleague, Casey O'Rourke, who is another parent coach, she has this beautiful phrase that is fiercely committed, lovingly detached, right? Which is, and I just love it. And I found out recently from her that it was actually a friend of hers that came up with the phrase, but it's this idea that we're committed, we're in it, we're there, we're showing up, we're present, we're doing all the things, and we're lovingly detaching from the outcome.
That's great.
I love it. I think it's such a beautiful way of sort of encapsulating what you and I are talking about right now. I want to touch on one other piece, and I know this isn't a direct element or piece of emotional intelligence, but I know that there is a harmonic sort of relationship between emotional intelligence and gratitude.
Ah, yes.
Can you just touch on the importance of gratitude for us a bit?
I think gratitude is the best stress reducer that you can. It makes you look around you and be grateful for what you are looking at and what you're feeling and what you're seeing. Gratitude, and we take it for granted. We only think of what I don't have, but reframe your thinking. What do you have? And even I tell parents when they feel burned out and frustrated and not feeling like they're good about themselves, we forget what's going well, and I think we have to be grateful for what is going well in our lives, no matter how horrible everything else seems. And teaching your kids to be grateful and not just saying thank you, but really understanding, the value of gratitude. I did a whole thing in the spring and early summer of sending out an email, and I called it Growing Your Gratitude, the Light of the Day. And for 75 days, I sent out a little piece about why gratitude has its benefits and stress reduction, being in touch with yourself, showing up, all those things that gratitude can do for you, and having, if you can, a gratitude journal, or having your kids every day tell you one thing that they're grateful for on that day, be it the flowers or their lunch, it doesn't matter. So I think gratitude is a really, really important part of our being, our well-being. And I don't think we talk about it enough. I think more recently, there's all kinds of scientific studies of the benefits of gratitude. And it's great for if you're depressed or you're anxious. We're all anxious because we feel uncertain, and ambiguity is a really hard one to kind of live and sit with. But it's an emotion, and you got a thought, your emotions lead to thoughts, and gratitude is a great tool.
Yes.
For parenting toolbox.
I love that you talk about this because, well, first of all, for that you did that 75 days of gratitude, which is so great. Just before Thanksgiving 2023, I recorded an episode for this podcast about gratitude and some of the like physical and emotional benefits that it has for us. But as you said, stories can always be helpful. And at the time that we are recording this, just yesterday, my husband and I had an issue come up in our family that, I hate to use the word emergency, but it was a bit of a family emergency that we had to address and that we are still navigating. And in the midst of that, it's really easy to get overwhelmed. And I did. And, to let the stress kind of settle in and the ambiguity and all of those things. And at one point he had run out and run an errand and he came in and he parked in the driveway and I walked outside and I said, let's just pause for a minute. Because I need you to know that as much as this sucks, what we're dealing with right now, I'm so grateful that we are figuring this out together.
That's great.
Yeah. And that moment it gave us a moment to both sort of pause and sit in that gratitude a little bit and go, okay, we're going to be okay. It shifted the mindset.
Right. I think that's so important, and emotional intelligence will lead to that, is being able to reframe when you have a thought or something happens, if you can kind of turn it on its head.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to be unrealistic. You can't change necessarily anything. I mean, we have no control. We can only control on how we respond.
Right. That is like the perfect phrase or sentence to end on, that we can only control how we respond. Joanne, this has been a really phenomenal conversation. I've gotten a lot out of it. I know that the listeners have as well. Thank you so much for everything that you've shared, the wisdom that you've put out into the world with this. Where is the best place for people to find you?
Well, they can go to my website, which is joannelight.com. They're welcome to email me. I love to respond to people. And on my website, there's a place to just connect and put you on my list, so will reach out to you. And I think my email is on the website as well.
Fantastic. Well, and you also have a free download on there, and we will make sure that all of that information is in the show notes so that everybody can find you, because if you're doing really cool things like sending out 75 days of gratitude, like I want to be a part of that. So Joanne, thank you for the work that you do in the world, for the wisdom that you've shared with us today. This has been really lovely.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it, and I appreciate your having me. I really do. Thanks, Christy.
All right, parents, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. And as I said at the beginning of this, I hope you got as much out of it as I did. I love getting to do these interviews for the podcast and for all of you, because they always help me learn and grow as well. And I hope that's the heart with which you approach these. How can I learn and grow from these episodes and these conversations? That framing of the difference between wanting and being willing is so critical. So I pose this question to you. What do you want and say that you want again and again, but haven't been yet willing to do on your parenting journey? And how can you make the shift from moving into not just wanting it, but also being willing to do it? If I can support you in any way with that, one-on-one coaching or with the Heartful Parent Academy, you know where to find me, theheartfulparent.com. I'll see you next week. Take care.